Welcome to Unlocking Your Truth, another podcast by Dr. Leslie Phillips.
Hello everybody, you are tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey.
Hello everyone.
And we are broadcasting from the unceded territory of the Stolo Nation on CIVL on 101.7 FM. Well, we have a fantastic show for you this evening, all about ghosties and ghoulies. You know, we always say this show is about metaphysics and spirituality and the paranormal, but we've actually done very few shows on the paranormal, so we want to correct that this evening. So we have invited onto the show one of our favorite guests because he's a local author here in BC, and his name is Frank Talaber. And he's going to tell us about his latest book, and also share with us some of the local knowledge that he uncovered and weaves into the story of his book that has to do with ghosts.
Well, it works out well because, you know, ghosts and cars go together in movies, so I guess that works out well for him.
So nobody else, I'll have to now read Frank's bio so people understand that joke.
You will.
Yes, so very briefly, Frank, he originally was born in Alberta, but he moved to Chilliwack, BC, which is where he lives now. And he spends part of his time fixing cars and managing automotive shops. So, but he is also a fantastic author and writer, and he's also a student of the esoteric and all things spiritual. And he's had several novels published through BWL Publishing, and the genres in which he writes include urban fantasy, thriller, crime, romance, science fiction, spiritual, erotica, and comedy. And he describes his writing style as a mix between Dan Millman, who wrote The Way of the Peaceful Warrior, Charles de Lint of Moonheart, and Tom Robbins, Even Cowgirls Get the Blues. And his latest book, and I want to read the prologue of his latest book because I think that will get us in the mood for the discussion topic. So the new book is called The Joining, and it's part of his Still Waters Run Deep series. And this is the prologue. Somewhere in the darkness, the coarse flax fibers of the hangman's noose sing, its hollow voice swinging to the hangman's beckoning, waiting for the answers buried into the gurgle of time and the finality of voices ending. From the stillness comes a subtle calling, echoing reminders of what remains, disturbed and unsettled. Oh, so welcome to the show, Frank.
Thank you and thanks for having me on the show, Leslie and Corey. And I hope that beginning pulls the readers in, because that's usually my intent. A lot of people ask me how to grab somebody, and I usually tell them I usually like to whack a reader upside the head and then pull them in kicking and screaming. So hopefully that kind of grabs your attention right away, especially if you're in the area of ghosts and esoterics. And then this actually, you said, is part of the Still Waters Run Deep series, but it's actually a new series called the Ainsworth Chronicles. All about Carol mainly, who's a detective. There'll still be some, Native First Nations and other ghosts of this area involved, but it's mainly about her detective work.
I see.
If I can go, I'll give you kind of the background. So she's gone undercover into the Empress Hotel because there's apparently two mafia families coming in for a quote wedding, and but that's actually not why they're there. The idea is there for a wedding, but they're actually opening up a West Coast drug operation. And they're involving something that I found in all my research that there's a lot of in the Victoria area. In addition to ghosts, there's also, satanic cults. So they're involving Satan to kind of bless them in their efforts. However, there is an old curse involving the native spirits in Victoria that involves Satan and them. And it's led to some of these ghosts, these native spirits, to be trapped in the sewers below Victoria. So by them being there, they've raised the anger and got all the ghosts upset. And so all sort of hell starts breaking loose because they're quite cranky about having this guy around. Unsettled business. And almost immediately, one of the mafia guys is found hanged in his room by what looks like a ghost. And then very quickly, young boys start disappearing that they think are all involved with, the needing bodies for the ceremonies, but it's nothing to do with that at all. It has to do with somebody that's going back and forth through time in a vortex that I've discovered happens in Victoria as well. And if you do any research, you'll see that there is, a lot of people reported a time vortex in Victoria, in addition to all the ghosts that they have there. Almost immediately, also, an old lady shows up, this old American psychic called Mystique, and bearing a crystal skull, who can read minds, and she talks to the skull. Yes, she's quite off the wall crazy. And she says Carol told her to come there, and Carol has no idea what she's talking about. And then everything else just starts unwinding from there.
Well, it sounds absolutely jam-packed with fabulous esoteric metaphysical things.
Yep.
I don't know what to ask you about first, but I think I'll ask you about, because I'm really curious, the time vortex in Victoria. So what's the history about? What's the deal with that?
So in Victoria, if you know Victoria at all, on Shelbourne and Hillside Streets, right near the shopping mall, going down Shelbourne, usually in October, a lot of people have reported driving along down the street late at night, usually about 2 o'clock in the morning, and all of a sudden everything vanishes as they drive along, and they're on this like dirt road. So they've gone back apparently 100 years, and 2 or 3 people have all reported this. Then as they continue sort of driving, everything sort of loops back to where they were.
That's fascinating.
Yes. And for a writer, that's just great stuff to spool my mind, obviously.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So did you drive in October in that place to see if
I did, absolutely. You got to experience it. So didn't go back in time, damn it. But anyways, I drove down there a couple times trying to get the feel for the place. I'm very intuitive, so often if I'm in some area where there's weird or spooky energies or stuff, I can usually pick up things. And yes, I kind of get this feel in that area that things aren't normal, is the only way to describe them. And lots of parts of Victoria are like that. They have ghost tours that take you through downtown Victoria. One of the other things I've discovered about Victoria, they say that there's lots of ghosts, and it is reportedly the most haunted city in all of Canada. And there's probably, in all my research, at least 30 different ghost stories. One of the things I have discovered, people have said that there are ley lines that run through Victoria, and I think that's probably what traps the spirits in Victoria, because the ley lines apparently are, from the other thing I've read, is that where they come together, there's like male and female energy centers that sort of curl around each other, almost like DNA strands.
Yes.
That's where they touch and meet. That's where they join, which is part of the idea of the book. That's where the sacred magic happens. And if you go to places like England, all those sacred spots are all where all the cathedrals, like Stonehenge, Glastonbury, Avebury, all those are on those spots.
Exactly.
And so the ancients knew that these were sacred areas, and they would practice their magic or their ceremonies there.
Yeah, and depending on how it's configured, I think that another name for them is nulls and nodes, and that energy is different. So that energy can either be opening up, or the opposite. And there's also supposed to be kind of like, what would you call it? A grid of human consciousness. So you've got the Earth grid.
Yep.
You've also got the human consciousness grid. And so there's special points as well where all where the human consciousness grid is intersecting.
I agree. I agree in that one because many years ago I took a course and they talked about getting in touch with something called the super consciousness, which is, I think, kind of what you're talking about, where if you relax and just let your mind accept from out there, and maybe this is where people get their readings from, and they get things brought to them by other beings from wherever. I don't know, but anyways, to do more with around here is if you allow yourself to release your own conscious energy and allow things to come in, you can tap into this super conscious grid or the human grid, as you call it. And that was one of the things I learned many years ago when I first started writing. The first course I ever took, and I always tell this when I do presentations, is there was a creative writing course in high school, and that tells you how many years ago that was. Anyways, the teacher opens the book on the first day of class and he goes, "So here's your material." And I open it up and I put my hand up. I go, "Yeah, but it's blank." He goes, "Yeah, your job is to fill it." And I said, "What?" And I had never experienced this before in my life. And he said, "So you just got to write." So you had to write for like 20 minutes. And the first few days, it was crazy. All I could write was, the girl in front of me is a blonde. The walls are still blue. What the hell am I doing here? Blah, blah, blah. But eventually, when you let go of your mind and just allow something out there to enter, for a writer, it just starts flowing. And before that class was over, I would sit down and I would just start pouring stuff out, like 5, 10, 15 pages, and it wouldn't stop. And half the time I look at what I wrote and go, "Holy cow, where'd that come from?" Because sometimes it's something I've worked on, but other times it just comes completely out of the blue.
Yeah, you're channeling it from the higher consciousness.
Correct. Absolutely correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the best writing is done that way, when we
Yes.
get out of our own way and just let it flow.
Yeah, and that was what he was trying to teach us, and just let go and just write. No, don't worry about editing. Don't worry about grammatical stuff. Just put it on the paper, and when you can do that and release your conscious mind, it's amazing. Sometimes I can't keep up. Like, it just starts pouring out of me, and it's wild.
That sounds like a really, really good writing course, because I think sometimes I've met a lot of people who want to write a book, and they get stuck in this constant loop of trying to perfect what they're writing. And often the courses they go to are focused on the rules of writing. You have to have the structure be like this, and you have to follow these rules. And it stops people getting into that creative flow that you're talking about. Yes,
and the creative flow is what's the most important thing. It's good to understand, structure and grammar and what parts of a novel you need, but you've got to get the story down first. And the whole idea is to get what you want to put down on the paper. I've always said, 95% of writing a book or I should say 5% of writing the book is writing the book. The other 95% is the editing, and more darn editing. That comes later.
Oh, I know. So Frank, let me ask you a direct question.
Sure.
Have you ever seen a ghost? Have you ever seen a ghost? You've been writing about ghosts. Have you ever seen one?
I actually haven't, but I've experienced some pretty spooky stuff a couple of times. The one I can think of, I may have related this last time, I don't remember. I went, one of my friends who was a very big spiritualist, and he would go hiking in sacred valleys. And so there's one near here up by Boston Bar. And he said the old native shamans would go down this valley and they would come back with visions and all this kind of stuff. So I said, okay, I'll try that. So I went, hiked into this valley, settled at the campsite, the only tent in the campsite, and we're talking about 10 miles in by this point. And so that night we're near the river, and as I'm sleeping in the tent, I can hear like scratching and noises outside the tent. And I thought, ooh, what's that? So when I worked up the courage, I grabbed my flashlight, looked around, nothing out there. And then I went back in the tent again, and sure enough, it started again several minutes later. And a second time, there's nothing out there. And that's about the closest I think I've seen to being around a ghost or seeing a ghost. It was definitely eerie. And I remember, crawling in my sleeping bag and doing the Hail Mary, Mother God, saying, please let me live. But after a while, when I kind of calmed down, relaxed, I almost got this sense that whatever was out there was sort of checking me out, and they're thinking, nah, he's okay. He's kind of like one of us, and just sort of left me alone. And I almost had this feeling, and I wrote this in some of my other books, of sinking down into the earth and traveling along the lines of the earth energies. It was the weirdest thing.
Cool.
I've seen ghosts.
Oh,
Have you?
Actually, I lived when I was 8 years old. My dad was he used to work on the Mount Royal Cemetery in Montreal, and I lived right in the center between two, the Protestant cemetery and the Catholic cemetery, for 4 years, and never saw a ghost there. But when I was when I was 6 years old, or probably closer to 5. I went to bed one night and I just laid down. My mother turned the light off, and almost instantly across the room, there was a man, a woman, and the woman had a baby, probably like 6 months old, little in her arms,
Yeah.
and they glowed, and they were dressed in Dickinson era, Dickensian era garments in that sort of style, or the the 1800s maybe in North America, and they sort of floated, and I didn't have the blankets on top of me, but it was instantaneously like my mother closed the lights and I turned and they were there. I did not fall asleep. They were just there, and then they slowly glided over. They didn't walk. They just glided over to my bed, and they were very friendly. And the woman kept looking at me, and the man looked at me, and then they would look at the baby. They look at me, and then they look at the baby. And so all of a sudden, I just said to Mom, I've seen your guests. Mom, I've seen your guests. I've seen them. And I heard my mother coming. And you know how sometimes when you go, depending on where the light switch is in the room, you turn the light on before you enter the room. And she turned the light on, and they were gone. And ever since that day, I haven't been able to sleep without having blankets on me.
I get that.
Yeah, I've actually had more than 2 experiences, and one in the last house I lived in, Burnaby. Just when I met Leslie, we had I think it was a sea captain or something, but he would walk the hallway, and you could see there were mirrors, full mirrors in the closet, in the linen closet, and you could sort of see him walking in front of the mirror, and there was you could see a bit of a reflection. And we had people come there, and they said, "Hey, did you see that? See what? Oh, there's something just went by there." So, yeah, that's our friendly ghost. I've had in the Maritimes. I've had several experiences when I lived in the Maritimes. It's very interesting.
Yes, it is.
yes.
Speaking of the ghosts of Victoria, one of the most famous is Doris Gravlin, who was killed by her husband on the Victoria golf course, and she's seen almost every year, April-ish, I think, usually. And then she was sort of chucked in the bushes off number 7 fairway, and then her husband they was killed shortly after that. So whether he committed suicide, they're not sure. They never did find out. But one of my friends I was just talking to at work, and he said, yes, he says, I've seen her. He says, I was sitting on the edge of the Victoria golf course with our 2 little kids, and I totally freaked out, kind of like you said. He said, I see this glowing green thing walking down the side of the hill. And I said, I bet you were near the number 7 hole. He goes, yes, I was. How'd you know that? I says, because there's a ghost there. And he goes, wow. He said, I wanted to go meet her. But he said, I had the 2 kids, so I didn't want to take a chance in case, something bad was going to happen.
So how long ago did she die?
She was 1920s, I think, roughly.
Okay.
And then she's one of the most famous ones they have there. They have several others. There's the one thing I write about in my series is the Lekwigan, the native spirits, and they're probably one of the most interesting stories. And I put this in the book. It has to do with the joining, and I'll explain that later. But the Lekwigan were a tribe that were all basically a village of the dead people. So they believe that the dead people don't pass away. Their spirits, their energy, their souls stick around. So they actually set up on the edge of Victoria Inner Harbor this whole village that they lived in, and basically they would put them up in trees, the bodies to decompose, to go back to nature. And when the first white people came over, the guy bought the land, and he starts clearing the land, and he says, hey, I got like all these bodies and these trees and stuff, and he says, you know what, we're just gonna bulldoze everything and burn it. And they said, no, you can't do that. He said, these are still alive. And he said, oh no, that's BS. And so he did that, and then, dumped all the remains in the ocean and stuff. And the native elder said, we're out of here because you've stirred them up. He says, they're going to be very angry. You've really, got them mad. So a couple of years later, everything gets quiet. A couple of years later, one night, the guy's factory that he puts on that property starts on fire. His house, which is miles away, starts on fire exactly at the same time. His wife went insane because she reported that she saw these beings with fire coming out of their hair and out of their hands, like stroking everything in her house. Wow. So he ended up, going bankrupt because his factory burnt to the ground and his house burnt down. His wife died 6 months later of insanity. Several years later, another white guy comes along and builds another factory. Hearing the stories, he says, I'm going to put the most advanced, and this is the late 1800s, the most advanced firefighting equipment I can in this factory, just because. Opening day of the factory, he walks into the factory, a pipe from about 30 feet up in the air breaks free, smashes him in the head and kills him. His son, as he hears this, what's happened to his dad, comes racing up on his chariot at the time. The horse sees something. As he approaches the gates of the factory, he gets spooked, comes to a skidding halt. The son goes flying off the front of the chariot, and then the horse, apparently, spooked again from behind, leaps forward and crushes him in the head as well.
Wow.
Yeah, that's quite a wild story, and one of the more famous ones in Victoria. So in my book, I also throw in this, the Lekwungen. So they've, in essence, are still around, but they've gone to dwell in the sewers, where all the sort of the ley lines of energy are. And
that's your artistic license.
Yes,
is that part of the story? Well, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we can hear more about the joining and maybe some more ghost stories from Victoria.
Okay.
So just a few ads, folks, and we'll be back on Unlocking Your Truth with Leslie Corrie and Frank Talaber. Welcome back, listeners, to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and with Corrie, and tonight's guest, Frank Talaber. Frank is a writer, and he's sharing his latest novel, which is called The Joining, with us. And it's a great excuse for us to talk about ghosts because he's weaving into the story in his latest novel some of the tales of ghosts and strange happenings that have happened in Victoria on Vancouver Island. And so Frank, tell us more about your book, and maybe some more of these ghost stories that you've woven into.
So as I've said earlier, there are ley lines across Victoria. And when you sit down and plunk down where a lot of the ghost stories are happening, like the sites, because they say ley lines travel in basically straight lines, and they do. If you can actually draw a line virtually through most of the bigger ghost stories of Victoria. One happens in the sewers, and this is here my artistic license again, but there's actually a place in Victoria called the Wall of Wonders. So what that is down in the sewers, and it's very close to the area of the time vortex, is all the drug addicts go down there and they hang out and they put all these needles in the walls after they're done. And apparently, and I've seen pictures, there's like hundreds of needles stuck in the walls. However, what happens is, in the book, is that the native spirits are trapped down there, kind of live off the energy of the people when they're drugged, that they use that to feed off of. So in the book, what happens though is there's a joining of some of these people, their essences, because their essences are still left behind in the vials, and one of these Lekwungen spirits then starts merging with this essence to start a new being, which in the end isn't even though it's built of two very sorrowful creatures, it actually has a very good karma to it, basically. So out of bad comes good. And I won't say any more because it would sort of wreck that plot line.
But that's an interesting concept, the merging of different entities to be a combined force. And what's your opinion? Do you think that that's something that can really happen?
Yes, I think it can. And a lot of people ask me, a lot of people say, well, I don't believe in ghosts. Well, I said, but do you believe in spirit and in your soul? Because if you believe that you have a soul, which most everybody does, you also believe that your soul is comprised of spirit. So in essence, most spirits can go to heaven, they can go to hell, they can go to wherever, whatever religious belief you have. But I do believe that sometimes that spirit can become either misguided or it can become trapped. A lot of people, there's a series of books I read by a native lady called Mary Summerrain, and she talks about all these ghosts that she encounters, and she's trying to help them. And what seems to be the common theme is that most of the people that are ghosts are simply spirits that either are stuck there waiting for someone to return, like they're expecting their husband to come back or their wife to come back from some journey they never did because something happened to them. Or they don't realize that they've passed away. And kind of like Corey was saying earlier about his story, that couple may not even realize that something happened and they've all died. They are just living their lives the way they've always done and always will for hundreds of years until either that spirit energy slowly diminishes and disappears, or at some point the realization is brought to them by somebody else or themselves that, hey, hang on, we're dead. And then they can leave. So it's kind of a fascinating concept. And that's kind of where I get my idea of where ghosts come from, really.
We have a friend of ours who a couple of years ago wrote a book, and it was, I forget what she called herself, the sleeping paramedic.
Oh, something
was
like
it
that.
Sleeping Paramedic, Leslie, or
the After Dark paramedic?
Something like that. Anyway, what she would do is she'd go into sort of like a semi-trance, and she'd go into an altered state, and she would help people cross over, spirits that were roaming the earth that didn't know how to get from point A to point B, and people would come to see her, and she would help them cross into the next phase of their existence. It's very interesting. Very interesting.
Yes, and that's kind of what I've read a lot of that, like this one series with this one lady, and a lot of the other stuff you read about. And I think ghosts are merely spirits that don't know, like I said, they're dead or that they've passed away, or they're stuck there because they can't get back, or they're told to stay there for another reason, and they just don't realize that they can leave.
Yeah, I think of them as fragments, actually, because the soul is eternal and the soul is multidimensional, but the soul projects aspects of its consciousness into these individuated experiences called lifetimes.
Yes.
And so it's that little pinched off piece of the soul that that gets trapped, doesn't realize that it's passed on, and all of the things that you're saying. And that brings me to and I'm sure you must know about this because of your interest in shamanism, but this practice of soul retrieval, because to me, that's collecting those fragments, your fragments that have been, left around the planet from various lifetimes. Because I think we all can have little pieces of ourselves, energetic pieces of ourselves trapped like that.
Yes, and if you listen to the Buddhists, they believe that you can have parts of your soul from this lifetime, past lifetimes, and future lifetimes all dwelling on the planet at this same time.
Yeah.
And that's, in a previous book, I wrote that Carol, the lead character of this book, encounters this fairy creature of the Haida. And at the end of the book, that creature says, "I am you in a future lifetime." She goes, "That's not possible." She says, "Yes, it is." And in essence, in that kind of belief. So yes, it's very interesting you mention about multidimensional cells of the soul, because the next series of books that I've already started to write and have written basically talks about that, where a guy, is sort of awakened to realize that he's got this whole other job to do to help save humanity, but he's experiencing all these different lifetimes that he swears he's never had, but he's lived them all. And it's part of the story is telling us some of those stories to make him realize the depth of his awareness, basically. the learnings that come from all this.
Yeah. Very cool. So tell us another ghost story. There's 30 of them in Victoria. That's quite a lot. Why do you think there are such a density of ghosts in Victoria?
I think, again, it has to do with the ley lines. I think it helps trap them in there if they don't realize it. The first ghost story I ever heard was from my son. He worked in a place called Nautical Nelly's. It's a restaurant in downtown Victoria. And when I first started doing some research, I said to him, I said, you know what? I hear there's all kinds of ghost stories in Victoria. He goes, oh yes, Dad. I said, there's one in Nautical Nelly's kitchen. And he's a chef, right? And he says, oh yes, Dad. He says, I can tell you about that ghost. He says, often you're in there all by yourself, and all of a sudden pans would fly across the counter or the jiggle off the wall. And he goes, you still work there? He says, yeah, absolutely. He says, I don't mind it. I go, I wouldn't stick around. He says, they don't harm me. He says, you kind of know that whatever's there isn't bad, because if it was, you'd sense it. And he said, I didn't care about it at all. I'm like, okay. I thought that was pretty good.
That brings us to another level of this discussion, because there are different categories of ghosts, aren't there? And what you're talking about is a poltergeist, I think.
Yes,
the ones
like a
that throw
poltergeist.
things around.
Yes, and there are some, what I call badass ghosts as well. I mean, there's lots of people that were never nice, and they got trapped here because maybe they didn't learn their lesson in this lifetime or whatever, or they're just bad news. And sure, there are good poltergeists, and then there's some bad ones as well. Ones you just want to go out there and scare you, and that's where all the great movies are, written from and produced from. But I don't think most of them are necessarily bad. And from what I read about most of the ghost stories of Victoria, most of these people aren't evil and not nasty. Some just want to scare you, and they want you away from them because maybe they don't like themselves and they don't like what's happened to them. But typically, I don't find many of them have any sort of bad energy to them, which is interesting because you'd think the opposite.
Well, it's almost energy sort of trapped in a different dimensional space.
Yep.
That we get a view into. And so they're going about their own business in their dimension and their timeline. And we've got a window to glimpse what's going on, perhaps.
Correct. And mentioned about the time vortex. Well, maybe in parts of these ley lines that are traveled through Victoria as well, there's more than one vortex, and maybe some of them are just hold the energy in of these people. Or, as you say, it could be that other souls are traveling through these vortexes, coming here and leaving, or coming here getting stuck. Who knows? All I know is that there's a lot of sort of sacred, magical areas of Victoria that really leave a lot to be said about all the spirit stuff.
I have an experience, anecdote, a story, talking about vortexes. I'm not sure that this is a vortex, but I went for a walk, probably 12 years ago, in Othello Tunnels. Othello Tunnels towards Hope, the old railway track.
Been there many times.
And I was with a walking group, and I didn't know everybody really personally on this walking group, but they were going pretty slow. And there was me and these two other women, and we wanted to exercise, so we kind of marched ahead. And so that was me in the center and these two other ladies either side, and we're in the middle of one of these tunnels, and all of a sudden everything disappeared. The floor, the walls, the roof, there was nothing except our bodies just suspended in nothingness. And of course, me being psychic and everything, I just thought it's just me having one of my experiences, and so I didn't say anything until like a split second later, these other two ladies either side of me went, "Whoa, what's happening?" And all of us simultaneously had this experience of just being suspended in nothingness, right? There was no up, down, side. There was nothing except our bodies. We didn't dematerialize our bodies. And it was bizarre. And it was like we were walking on air, and you could see, it was like the molecules of space going past, like really, 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 really fast. And It was just really odd. And then we sort of eventually found ourselves walking back in reality, our normal reality space. And we were like, what the heck was that? And we retraced our steps, and we went back into the tunnel, and we tried to recreate the experience, and it didn't happen the second time. And then we waited for all the other walkers to catch up with them to see if it would happen to them, and it didn't happen to them. But that was a pretty bizarre experience, I have to say.
I agree. And I've been to the tunnel a few times, and I read that, yes, a lot of people say that there are a lot of good energy and karma there, and weird things do happen. And I have one story about the tunnels myself. My wife's English, and her dad came to visit us, this was about 8 years ago. And so we took him there just so he could, because he loved trains. So I said, well, let's go through these tunnels. You'll see these old train tunnels, and as you know, the water is cascading around down there, and it's just absolutely spectacular. And it's a level walk. So this guy, he's in his 80s, so I thought it'd be easy for him. So we're walking through the tunnels, and like you said, he stopped, and he said, "Did you hear that?" Me and my wife turned around and said, "Hear what?" He goes, "She's here." He said, "I heard her talking to me." His first wife died about 30 years ago. And he said, "I swore I just heard her voice talking to me, and I could swear that she reached out and touched me." And this guy is not a spiritualist or nothing at all like that. He's very straight-laced, and he was pretty like you. He was pretty shook up, and he swore. He said, "No, I felt and just heard her," and that was interesting.
That is interesting. It's interesting to me because I've never heard. I had my own experience there, but I never heard that other people have had experiences in there as well.
And I've read many people have experiences, or that they just say that when you walk in, you can just feel the energy of the area change. It's very good karma in there, which is
haven't been there yet.
Yeah, when you think it's the middle of a tunnel that you bombed through the side of a mountain, you wonder why. But it is what it is. For whatever reason.
Yeah. We should take a break, Leslie.
Yeah, let's take a break. Listeners, you've been tuning into Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie Corey and today's guest, Frank Talaber, who's an author, and his latest book is called The Joining, and he's weaving together stories of ghosts and time vortexes and ley lines, and we haven't even asked him about the crystal skulls yet, so maybe after we'll do that.
I'm not going to sleep tonight.
So we'll be back after these few short messages, listeners. Welcome back, listeners. You are tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey, and our guest today, Frank Talaber. Our topic this evening is ghosts. And we're enjoying talking to Frank about his latest book called The Joining, especially because, as usual, he has woven into this book some really interesting metaphysical topics. He's been telling us all about the time vortex in Victoria, in British Columbia, the ley lines, and the ghosts. But you also mentioned, Frank, that one of the new characters in your latest book is a mystical psychic with a crystal skull. And so, yeah, let's talk about the crystal skulls, because that's another fascinating topic. And
it is. And her name's Agnes Van Lunt. She's 78, 79 years old. Very rich, well-to-do now, because she's had several husbands that have passed away. And she not only, through the crystal skull, she can not only read other people's minds and visions, and she has a psychic act. She calls herself Mystique, and so she would actually pick up people's thoughts, and they'd pay her to do this stuff. But she arrives there claiming that Carol, the main character, asked her to be there, and Carol, of course, says, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I've never met you before in my life." But then she soon realizes that, in fact, this lady can read her mind, which kind of irks her a lot, because she can't say anything without the other lady finishing her thoughts. But through the crystal skull, she has then access to other dimensions, and other realities, because she can kind of go into the skull and then from there travel to where she needs to travel to find stuff, because she's looking. Actually, the real reason she's been called there is because she's getting paid by somebody to look into the death of her son that died about 30 years earlier. And so she's using the crystal skull to go back in time, only to realize that there is somebody else, that's the person that's abducted this boy in the first place, also has sort of, just say it's satanic links. And she's now chasing Agnes as well. And the rest I don't want to talk about in the book because it kind of wrecked the rest of the book. But basically Agnes is now being hunted by this other person.
So I assume you got the idea for having a crystal skull in your story from the true stories of the crystal skulls that have been found.
Absolutely.
In Mayan pyramids that are supposed to have
Yep.
very interesting properties.
Yes.
And these skulls have been studied scientifically, and they're ancient. And when they look at the surface of the skull and they have the perception of what technology could have been around at the time they believe they were made, these things are perfect. They're perfectly done, beyond the level that a machine even today could do. And so
Yes.
they're a bit of an enigma, and many people have reported having mystical experiences and seeing visions in the skulls, and the skulls talking to them.
Correct. And when you think about the if it's kind of like the pyramids, if you look at the technology that made the main pyramid and the skulls, and we were talking about stone chisels and axes. Yeah, I don't buy it. There's no way. And if that's all they had, I mean, you can't build that structure today. You can't build those skulls today with that kind of precision. At least not without tens of hundreds of years of whatever. So they are amazing, and even the story. When I read the original story about how that first one was found, he says his daughter found it behind this temple thing.
Anna Mitchell Hedges, I think.
That's the one. That's the one. And
and
then you go, yeah. There's no. He planted it there. He found it somewhere else. And so in my book, what I'm saying is that he's got several of these, and he ends up. One of the characters buys one and ends up in the long story short, they end up selling it to Agnes, who now becomes its owner and uses it because she can go travel through it to the past, the present, wherever she's got to go sometimes, or just read other people's thoughts through it.
Yeah, well, I remember. Before I ever heard about the crystal skulls, which was a really long time ago, like I moved from England 20 years ago, and the first time I heard about them was a couple of people who'd created a TV documentary about them and written a book about them, and I forget their names now. I'd had dreams about the crystal skulls before that, and apparently other people as well. And my dreams, this sounds a bit strange, but it was like I was on a spaceship and the crystal skull was the central console running the spaceship.
Cool.
And it was, literally, because quartz crystal stores information, doesn't it? We use
Correct.
it to store information in our systems these days. And so I had quite a few dreams about myself in another existence, traveling on a spaceship that was controlled by a crystal skull and landing on this planet.
Interesting.
And so, yeah, and then when I went to this lecture over 20 years ago and I talked to the authors of that book, they said, you're not the only one who's had those kinds of dream experiences.
Wow.
And I went to see, there used to be one in the British Museum. I think.
Yes, I remember hearing about that.
And I went to see it because I thought, maybe I'll pick up the vibe from it. And actually, I didn't really pick up much from it. It was a really small, and it was in a container with lots of other ones. Which I have to say, there are other things in the British Museum which have amazing energy, especially in the ancient Egyptian
Correct.
exhibits. Some of those statues, like, unbelievable.
Yes,
intelligent.
agreed. When I talked about the pyramids earlier, one of this new book series that I've done, there's a short few pages about the technology that they put to use to build the pyramid. Lots of fascinating stuff, like up till I think the Eiffel Tower was built. That was the tallest structure on Earth. More closer aligned to true magnetic Earth than any or north than any other building, including the ones that the English built for the forget when we're clocking time. I can't remember what it's called. It's actually closer to true north. It's also built in the center. If you were to take the longest lines of land, north and south and east and west, it's dead center. It's also a dead center of a lot of, like, a huge ley line area. And then they're talking also about something like 22 million blocks of stones to build this thing. And if it was indeed built in 20 years, like the one Pharaoh says it was, they said you'd have to lay down one block of stone every 5 or 6 minutes, day and night, 7 days a week for 20 years. Like we couldn't do that today.
Yeah.
And perfectly straight. Each side is perfectly aligned. The whole entire structure is on a plane that's within, I think they said, a quarter inch of dead flat.
Yeah. And that's the Giza Plateau.
Yeah.
And they're also in the configuration of Orion.
Correct. And they've now discovered other ones. There's some over in Mexico in the Mayan pyramids. Yeah. There's also a group over in China.
Yes.
Found
Bosnia as well.
Yes, and exactly built the same way. And these are all covered over with trees and stuff. The Chinese are trying to deny they're there. But you see old pictures and you can see that it's built exactly the same dimensions as the ones in Egypt. So fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it? There's so much. I mean, we think we know it all, don't we? But there's so much prehistory that is covered up by the sands of time that we will never know.
Correct.
Unless we can look through a crystal skull or use our psychic abilities.
We know the fella in I think he's still in Washington State, in Seattle.
Joshua.
Joshua Shapiro. When he's seen the skulls,
he owns some of them.
Yeah, he owns some of the skulls. He's quite an interesting character, and he has some interesting stories on people around that, in that realm. Very, very, very interesting. We lost touch with him, though. He still emails me once in a while. But
he stayed overnight in one of our friends' houses, and he brought his crystal skulls, and she slept with one of these crystal skulls on her bedside table. And she had the craziest experience of her life, because you know those dreams where you wake up and you get up and you go about your business, and then you realize you're still asleep actually, and you didn't wake up. It happened to her over and over and over and over again, like Groundhog Day.
Wow.
Yeah, she had quite the experience.
Oh yeah.
So tell our listeners, Frank, I know that you've got a local book signing coming up, and we do have local listeners, but we also have listeners all over the world. So how can people find out more about you?
Well, if they go to Amazon, I have a page on Amazon where all my novels are on there. So just go to Amazon.com and put my name in, and you'll find me. All 5 of my books are in there. The local, for anyone in BC that's interested in buying this book or any of my other ones, I'll be at the Indigo Grandview Corners on this Saturday on the 26th between 1 and 4. I have my books for sale there. And I'm also on Facebook as well. You can put my name up there under published author, Frank Talaber, published author, and you'll find me there too.
Thank you. And you alluded a little bit earlier to the next series of books, which sounds really, really fascinating. So
yes, my title so far will be "What I'd Ask Buddha If I Met Him in a Bar."
That's a very good title.
Thank you. And it's all about basically this guy who not only doesn't believe in chakras, he says, I don't even know how to spell the word, but he's one of the ones that has been elected to basically go through a series of tests to prove that we're ready for ascension into the next level of being, like the fourth dimension of humanity. And so he has to go through several tests, one of which involves he's going on his honeymoon. He travels to an airport, and he finds an alien stone in him, which kind of wrecks all of his stuff, but it starts awakening him.
Wonderful.
There you go.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you, Frank. And as usual, there's
Not
barely
enough
enough
time.
time to keep talking about these amazing things. But we have come to the end of the show. Listeners, you've been tuning in this evening to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and with Corey, talking about ghosts with Frank. And Frank, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me on the show. Highly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care. See you for next week, folks. Thank you for joining us. You've been listening to another Unlocking Your Truth podcast by Dr. Leslie Phillips. For more information, go to our website at drlesleyphillips.com. That's drlesleyphillips.com, where you can ask questions or send her an email, and there's many free gifts on there for you as well. You can also find the questions that were asked during this show at the website on our free card reading podcast page, where you'll find a full list of them. Come back again.